The homeless shelter director called me. Did your son ever talk about wanting to hurt the homeless? I almost dropped my coffee. What? Number. Jordan volunteers at your shelter every Saturday morning. Why would he? Mika's voice was cold through the phone. Mr. Plow, Jordan attacked our Christmas food truck this morning. He's the reason 300 homeless veterans are hungry this Christmas. My stomach dropped. This has to be a mistake. He spent his birthday money on sleeping bags for your shelter. He wouldn't do that. She sighed like I was a criminal for believing my own son. He's already in handcuffs and already confessed to everything in writing. I felt my legs buckle. Let me talk to him. That's not possible right now. You need to come down here. I left work immediately, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. At the shelter, Mika was waiting in the parking lot. She was wearing a business suit despite it being Christmas Eve afternoon. Behind her, the food truck sat demolished, its serving window caved in, and the food trays on the asphalt. Your son did this deliberately, she said. We have video footage of the crime. Where is Jordan? I asked, more focused on that. Police station. But before you go, you need to understand what happened. Her tone was practiced. He showed up this morning acting erratic, screaming about something. When the staff tried to calm him, he left. 20 minutes later, he came back and crashed his car into the truck. My eyebrows raised, but Jordan doesn't have a license yet, much less his own car. Mika's expression didn't change. I guess it was a stolen vehicle then. Disturbed people do disturbed things. I stared at her and the destroyed truck. He's not disturbed. He knows these people. He tutors Robert's kid for free. Mr. Plow, troubled individuals get close to their intended victims first. Her dismissal of everything I said made me suspicious. Why was she so quick to dismiss her shelter's volunteer of the month? Could I be sure Jordan even did this crime? I want to see the security footage you mentioned, I said. The police have it, she responded. I stared at her. You just told me you have the video. Yeah, but it's confidential. I can't share. Let me see the video, I interrupted. Reluctantly, she pulled out her phone and opened the video. The footage was so grainy I could barely make anything out. I saw someone who looked like Jordan grabbing staff members by the shoulders and pointing at the truck. See how aggressive he's being? Mika said like this was in 4K. I don't even know what I'm looking at. She rolled her eyes, then looked over at an older man sweeping up debris. Frank, you were here this morning. What happened? He glanced at Mika, then nodded. Jordan kept yelling about poisoning the homeless people. Then when we removed him, Kid came back and nearly killed everyone. Mika stepped forward quickly. See? Your kid totally lost it. She put her phone back in her pocket without letting me see the rest of the footage. I found myself sitting at the police station 20 minutes later. The desk sergeant, someone I recognized from Jordan's basketball league, looked uncomfortable. We have his written confession. Can I see it? That's not protocol. Can I see my son at least? He's being processed, so no. I was losing my patience. What does the confession say exactly? The sergeant shifted in his seat. That he deliberately stole a vehicle and destroyed property belonging to the shelter. It felt like a stomach punch. He'd actually done it. At least that's how it seemed. I was about to ask him if Jordan gave a motive when Mika appeared in the station lobby. Turns out she'd followed me. I've been trying to explain to Mr. Plow that his son has shown signs of disturbance recently, she cut in front of me. That's not true, I responded. Yes, it is. The obsession with our food handling. The aggressive behavior towards staff. It's been happening for weeks. He's never been aggressive in his life, I shouted over her. Do you have footage of this? The desk sergeant interrupted us. We both looked at him. Yes, I do, Mika said defiantly. She pulled out her tablet. Here it is. The three of us watched the grainy footage of someone who kinda resembled Jordan running toward a car. He smashed the window with a rock, climbed inside and drove off. The camera cut, and suddenly a car that looked similar was heading directly at the Christmas food truck. The impact was devastating. The truck's side caved in. Equipment flew everywhere. After a minute, Jordan climbed out and stood just there, hands at his sides, waiting. Not running, just waiting. Police came and took him away minutes later. My legs felt weak as I tried to stammer out words. Is that actually him? I'm sorry, Mika said like her word was law. But your son made 300 homeless people go hungry on Christmas Eve. I looked at the desk sergeant, but he just shrugged. There's video evidence. My hands are tied. And I can't go in to talk to him? Sorry, Mr. Plow. The answer's no. I put my head down and went to the lobby with the intention of waiting until they let me in to speak to Jordan. Mika was strangely insistent I just leave. Then, 3 hours after I sat down, an officer came out holding an evidence bag. Jordan's phone was visible inside. This thing won't stop going off, she said. I shot up immediately. Password is his birthday, I said. 0314. She typed it in. A voice recording was paused on the screen. She hit play by accident. What played next changed everything. Jordan's voice came through the phone speaker, clear as anything. You can't serve that meat, it smells wrong. A pause, then an older man's voice, angry and rushed. Mind your own business, kid, we're behind schedule. The recording kept going with sounds of movement and muffled arguing before the officer fumbled with the phone and stopped it. Her face went pale. She looked at the desk sergeant, then at me, then back at her supervisor's office like she needed to tell someone immediately. I shot up from my chair. Let me take my son home right now. The desk sergeant held up both hands. Mr. Plow, he's been formally charged and processed already. I can't just release him. The female officer was already pulling her supervisor aside near the hallway. They spoke in whispers I couldn't quite hear. Mika stood frozen by the doorway. Her confident posture from earlier was completely gone. She was staring at the phone in the officer's hand like it was a bomb. I moved toward the door before she could leave. She tried to step around me, but I blocked her path. Why was Jordan warning about spoiled meat if he's so disturbed and violent? Mika's mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. He was confused, making things up because he was upset about something. Her voice had no strength behind it anymore. That recording says otherwise. She looked around like she was searching for an escape route. He misunderstood what he saw. The meat was fine. But she wasn't meeting my eyes when she said it. The desk sergeant walked over and put his hand on my shoulder. You can see Jordan for 10 minutes while we figure out what to do about this recording. I didn't wait for him to change his mind. I practically ran down the hallway to the holding area. A different officer buzzed me through 2 locked doors. Jordan was sitting on a metal bench in a small room with concrete walls. He looked exhausted. His eyes were red. When he saw me, he started crying immediately. Dad, I'm so sorry about the car, but I had to stop them. His words came out in gasps between sobs. They were going to serve bad food. The meat delivery this morning smelled rotten. I told them, but they wouldn't listen. I sat down next to him and put my arm around his shoulders. He leaned against me like he used to when he was little. The staff kept saying they were behind schedule for the Christmas meal. They had to serve it on time no matter what. But Dad, the meat had this weird smell. Kind of sweet, but also like ammonia. And it looked wrong. His hands were shaking as he tried to explain everything at once. I hugged him tighter. We're going to fix this, I promise. Then I asked about the car because I needed to understand everything. Jordan pulled back and wiped his eyes with his sleeve. I panicked. No one would listen to me about the food. Frank was worried too, but Mika told him to stop complaining. So I went to the staff office and took Frank's keys off the desk. I just thought if I could block the truck somehow, they couldn't serve the food. His voice got quieter. I didn't mean for it to crash so hard. The floor mat got stuck under the brake pedal and I couldn't stop in time. I told him again that we'd figure it out together. The officer came back and said my 10 minutes were up. I walked back to the lobby feeling like my brain was moving in 3 directions at once. The desk sergeant was at his desk filling out paperwork. I walked right up to him. That recording needs to be preserved as evidence. Don't let anyone delete it. He nodded without looking up. It's already been logged into evidence. Can't be destroyed even if someone wanted to. Mika was standing in the corner on her phone. Her back was to me, but I could hear parts of what she was saying. We need damage control immediately. Call the board members. This could destroy everything we've built. Not once did she mention 300 people who might have gotten sick. Not once did she seem concerned about whether the food was actually bad. She cared about the shelter's reputation and nothing else. I left the station and sat in my car for a minute trying to think clearly. It was Christmas Eve evening now. Most offices would be closed, but I needed a lawyer who handled criminal defense for kids. I pulled out my phone and started searching. Most numbers went to voicemail. Finally, I found an emergency contact number for a public defender's office. I left a detailed message explaining everything about Jordan, the recording, and the food safety concerns. Then I drove home and waited. The public defender called back 50 minutes later. I explained the whole situation again while pacing around my kitchen. The recording of Jordan warning about the meat, the confession he signed, the fact that he's never been in trouble before. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a few seconds. The confession might be challenged if he was scared and didn't fully understand his rights, especially if the intake process was rushed. She asked me to send her the case number and said she'd look into it first thing after Christmas. I thanked her about 5 times before hanging up. I opened my laptop and started searching for anything about food poisoning and shelter inspections. My hands were still shaking a little, but I needed to do something useful instead of just sitting there worried. The city's health department website had inspection records going back 3 years. I found Mika's shelter and clicked through the reports. The last inspection was 6 months ago in June, and they'd passed with no major problems. Just a note about needing better labels on storage containers. I kept digging and found news articles from local papers about budget cuts to homeless services. One article from September mentioned shelters struggling to feed everyone and having to accept food donations closer to their expiration dates because they couldn't afford to be picky. Another article talked about how the winter months were hardest because more people needed help, but donations dropped off after the holidays. I made notes of everything and saved the articles to a folder on my desktop. It was past midnight now and I was exhausted, but I couldn't sleep knowing Jordan was spending Christmas Eve in a cell. Christmas morning felt wrong without Jordan home. I called the public defender at 9 a.m., even though I knew it was a holiday. She picked up on the third ring. I apologized for bothering her on Christmas, but she said she'd been thinking about Jordan's case anyway. She told me we needed to get him released on bail first before we could build any kind of defense. The bail hearing would probably be scheduled for the day after Christmas since the courts were closed today. She explained that we'd need to show Jordan wasn't dangerous and wouldn't run away. Character references would help a lot. I thanked her again and started making a list of everyone who knew Jordan and could vouch for him. I spent the whole day driving around town tracking people down. Jordan's English teacher lived across town, and I caught her coming back from her mom's house with leftover pie. She wrote a letter right there on her kitchen table about how Jordan was one of her best students and always helped other kids with their homework. The basketball coach was harder to find, but I finally got him on his cell phone at his brother's place. He said he'd email me a reference by that evening. Robert was the most important one. I found him at the shelter even though it was Christmas. He was sitting on the steps with a few other guys. When I explained what I needed, he got tears in his eyes and said Jordan was the only person who'd ever treated his daughter like she mattered. He wrote 3 paragraphs in shaky handwriting about how Jordan tutored her every week and brought her books from the library. The bail hearing was at 10 a.m. the day after Christmas. The courthouse was nearly empty because of the holiday week. I sat in the front row clutching my folder of character references. Jordan was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit that was too big for him. He looked so tired and young. The judge was an older woman with gray hair pulled back tight. She read through Jordan's file while Mika's lawyer stood up and argued that Jordan was dangerous and had deliberately destroyed property. He made it sound like Jordan was some kind of criminal mastermind. Then our public defender presented the character references. The judge read each one carefully. She looked at Jordan over her glasses and asked him directly if he understood the charges. Jordan said yes in a quiet voice. The judge said she was setting bail at $5,000 based on his clean record and strong community ties. I nearly collapsed with relief. I went straight to the bail window and emptied my emergency savings account. 40 minutes later, Jordan walked out of the courthouse into the winter sunlight. Jordan barely said anything on the drive home. He went straight to his room and I heard the shower running for almost 30 minutes. When he came out, he looked a little better, but his eyes were red. We sat at the kitchen table and I made him eat something even though he said he wasn't hungry. That's when he started talking about what really happened Christmas Eve morning. Frank had been complaining about the meat delivery all morning. The boxes had arrived late, and when Frank opened them, the smell was bad. He'd gone to Mika and told her they couldn't serve it. But Mika said they'd already paid for the delivery and couldn't afford to waste the food. Frank had argued with her right there in front of the other staff. Mika won the argument because she was the boss. Jordan heard the whole thing while he was setting up chairs for the meal service. That's when he started trying to warn people. I called the city health department as soon as Jordan finished telling me everything. It was the day after Christmas, so I got a voicemail. I left a detailed message explaining the timeline of events on Christmas Eve. I mentioned the voice recording on Jordan's phone that was now in police evidence. I said I was worried about food safety violations and asked them to investigate. Then I sent a follow-up email with all the same information, plus the case number from the police report. The public defender came to our house 2 days later. She sat at our kitchen table with a legal pad and listened while Jordan told her the whole story from the beginning. He described how the meat had a weird greenish color around the edges and smelled like ammonia. He said 2 staff members had been arguing about whether cooking it thoroughly would make it safe to eat. Mika had ended the argument by saying they were behind schedule and needed to start serving food in 20 minutes. Jordan had tried to talk to Frank, but Frank just shook his head and walked away looking upset. That's when Jordan started going up to people in line and trying to warn them not to eat the food. The staff had grabbed him by the shoulders and walked him outside. He'd stood in the parking lot for a few minutes trying to figure out what to do. Then he'd seen Frank's keys sitting on the desk in the office through the window. I drove back to the shelter parking lot the next morning with my phone ready to take pictures. The damaged food truck was still sitting there waiting for insurance to look at it. I took photos of the truck from every angle. Then I photographed the tire marks on the pavement and the position of everything. Something looked off about the angle of impact. Mika had described it like Jordan came flying across the parking lot trying to destroy everything. But the tire marks showed the car had come from the side street and hit the truck almost straight on. The serving window was smashed in, but the rest of the truck wasn't that damaged. It looked more like someone trying to block the window than someone trying to wreck the whole vehicle. The health inspector called me back 3 days after I left my message. She asked if I could send her a copy of the voice recording from Jordan's phone. I explained it was locked in police evidence, but gave her the case number. She said she'd request a copy for her investigation. She also asked for the names of anyone who'd gotten sick after eating at the shelter on Christmas Eve. I told her about the 3 veterans Robert had mentioned and gave her Robert's phone number so she could contact him directly. I found Robert at his usual spot near the shelter the following afternoon. He was sitting on a bench reading a paperback with a torn cover. I asked him if he'd been there Christmas Eve morning and seen what happened. Robert put his book down and nodded slowly. He said he'd watched Jordan pointing at the food truck and trying to tell people something. The staff had waved Jordan away like he was bothering them. Then Jordan had left looking really upset. About 20 minutes later, Robert heard a crash and saw Jordan climb out of Frank's car. Jordan hadn't run away or tried to escape. He just stood there with his hands at his sides waiting for the police to come. Robert said it was the weirdest thing because Jordan looked relieved when they put the handcuffs on him. Robert looked at me for a long moment before continuing. He said something else happened that night that nobody wanted to talk about. Several of the veterans who ate the Christmas meal got really sick later that evening. Stomach problems, bad ones. None of them went to the hospital because they figured it was just a bug going around, or maybe they ate something else that disagreed with them. Robert gave me 3 names of people who could confirm they had the same symptoms. I wrote the names down in my phone notes immediately. I thanked Robert and headed home to start making calls. I spent the entire next day tracking down the 3 veterans Robert had mentioned. The first guy I found was camped under an overpass about 2 miles from the shelter. He confirmed he ate at the shelter Christmas Eve afternoon and spent that whole night with severe nausea and diarrhea. He thought he was going to die, but it passed by morning. The second veteran I located at a different shelter across town. He had the same story. Bad stomach cramps starting around 8 that night, threw up multiple times, felt awful until the next afternoon. The third person was harder to find, but I eventually caught up with him at a soup kitchen. He not only confirmed his own food poisoning symptoms, but said he saw at least 4 other people getting sick too. Everyone just assumed it was a stomach bug making the rounds. Nobody connected it to the shelter food because they figured the shelter would never serve bad meat. I took detailed notes from all 3 conversations and got their phone numbers in case we needed them to give official statements later. When I got home that evening, I called the public defender and told her everything I'd learned. She listened carefully and said this was exactly the kind of evidence we needed. She was going to file a motion to suppress Jordan's confession based on improper procedures during his intake at the police station. The confession had been signed at the exact time he was supposed to be getting a medical evaluation, which proved the process was rushed. She also planned to request that the voice recording be admitted as evidence at any future hearing. Then she said she was going to subpoena the shelter's food delivery records and temperature logs for Christmas Eve. If they had documentation showing the food was stored improperly or came from questionable sources, that would support Jordan's claims about the meat being spoiled. I felt hopeful for the first time since this whole nightmare started. The next morning, my phone rang while I was making coffee. It was Mika. Her voice sounded different from before, less confident and more nervous. She asked if we could talk about dropping the case. She said if I agreed to let it go, she wouldn't press charges against Jordan, and we could all move on. I felt my anger rising immediately. I told her I wanted to know why she tried to serve spoiled meat to hungry veterans on Christmas Eve. There was a long silence on the other end. Then she said I was making wild accusations without proof and hung up on me. I stood there holding my phone, shaking with frustration. 2 hours later, a woman from the city health department showed up at our house. She introduced herself as the health inspector handling the investigation into the shelter. She needed to interview Jordan officially about what he saw and experienced that morning. I brought Jordan into the living room, and he sat down across from her at our kitchen table. She had a notepad and was taking detailed notes as Jordan walked her through the entire morning. He described arriving at the shelter around 7 in the morning like he did every Saturday. The meat delivery truck was there unloading boxes. Jordan helped carry some of the boxes inside, and that's when he noticed the smell. It was a strong ammonia smell mixed with something rotten. He mentioned it to one of the staff members who opened a box and looked at the meat. The color was off, kind of greenish in spots. Jordan heard 2 staff members arguing about whether they should use it. One person said they needed to throw it out immediately. The other person, who Jordan thought was Mika but he wasn't completely sure, said they were already behind schedule and couldn't afford to waste the food. They'd cook it thoroughly and it would be fine. Jordan kept insisting it wasn't safe. He could tell from the smell alone that something was seriously wrong with that meat. But the staff told him to mind his own business and eventually walked him outside when he wouldn't stop protesting. That's when the panic set in. Jordan knew 300 people were going to eat that food in a few hours. He knew some of them had weak immune systems or health problems that would make food poisoning really dangerous. He stood in the parking lot trying to figure out what to do. The health inspector asked Jordan why he didn't just call the police or the health department directly. Jordan admitted he didn't think of that in the moment. He was 17 and scared and not thinking clearly. All he could focus on was stopping the food from being served before people got sick. The inspector finished taking notes and thanked Jordan for his detailed account. She said she'd be in touch if she needed any follow-up information. After she left, I made another decision. I needed an independent accident reconstruction expert to examine the vehicles and crash site. It was going to cost money I really didn't have, but I needed to know exactly what happened during that crash. I found a company that did accident investigations and explained the situation. They quoted me $800 for a full examination and report. I put it on my credit card. The health inspector called me back 3 days later. She said the shelter had a minor violation on record from 8 months ago for improper food storage temperatures. Nothing major, just a warning to fix their cooler settings. But there wasn't much else in their official file. She sounded frustrated that there wasn't more documentation of ongoing problems. I got the sense she believed Jordan, but needed more concrete evidence to take serious action against the shelter. That evening, I went through my own records looking for anything that might help Jordan's case. I found the receipt from when Jordan bought those sleeping bags for the shelter with his birthday money. The date was just 6 weeks ago. The receipt showed he'd spent $240 of his own money on warm sleeping bags for homeless veterans. I made a copy of it to give to the public defender. This proved Jordan cared deeply about helping the people at that shelter. He wasn't some disturbed kid trying to hurt anyone. The accident reconstruction expert called me a few days later. He'd finished examining both vehicles and taking measurements of all the impact damage. His preliminary findings were interesting. The collision was relatively low speed based on the crush patterns and deformation of the metal. He estimated Jordan was going maybe 15 miles per hour when he hit the truck. The food truck had been parked at an angle near the curb, not straight in a parking space. The impact point and damage pattern suggested Jordan was trying to block the serving window specifically, not destroy the entire vehicle. This matched what Jordan had told me about panicking and just wanting to stop them from serving the food. I also filed a public records request for the shelter's vendor invoices since they received city funding. It took about a week to get the documents. When they arrived, I spent an entire evening going through page after page of delivery records and invoices. The meat delivery on Christmas Eve came from a discount supplier I'd never heard of. I looked them up online and found they specialized in selling food products that were close to their expiration dates at reduced prices. Grocery stores and restaurants used them to get cheaper ingredients. I printed out everything and added it to the growing pile of evidence we were collecting. The next morning, my phone rang with an unknown number. I answered and heard Frank's voice, quiet and nervous, asking if we could meet somewhere away from the shelter. I agreed immediately and suggested a coffee shop on the other side of town where no one from the shelter would see us. An hour later, I sat in a corner booth watching the door until Frank walked in looking over his shoulder like someone might be following him. He slid into the seat across from me, and his hands were shaking as he wrapped them around the coffee cup I'd already ordered for him. He started talking before I could even ask what was wrong. "The meat that morning was definitely spoiled," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It had a greenish color and smelled wrong when they opened the delivery boxes." He'd told Mika right away that they couldn't serve it, but she'd insisted they had to because the shelter was almost out of money and they couldn't afford to waste an entire food delivery. Frank pulled out his phone with trembling fingers and showed me photos he'd taken that morning. The temperature logs from the walk-in cooler showed readings in the danger zone for 2 full days before the event. He'd reported the warm cooler to Mika on the 22nd, he explained, but she'd said they couldn't afford repairs until after the holidays when the next budget payment came through. I stared at the photos showing temperatures hovering around 50 degrees when they should have been below 40. This was exactly the kind of evidence we needed to prove Jordan wasn't crazy or violent. I asked Frank if he would testify to all of this in court, and his face crumpled. He started crying right there in the coffee shop, tears running down his weathered cheeks as he told me he needed his job desperately. Mika had already threatened to fire him if he talked to anyone about what happened, he said between sobs. He had bills to pay and nowhere else to work at his age. I reached across the table and put my hand on his arm, promising I would protect him as much as I possibly could. But I also had to be honest with him that Jordan's entire future was at stake here. My son could end up with a serious criminal record that would follow him for life if we couldn't prove he was trying to prevent people from getting poisoned. Frank wiped his eyes and nodded slowly, saying he would think about it and let me know. I thanked him for meeting with me and for being brave enough to take those photos. After he left, I sat there for another 20 minutes forwarding the photos to the public defender, along with a detailed message about everything Frank had told me. She called me back within an hour and said this was huge. She would file an amended motion right away, including Frank's testimony about the spoiled meat and the broken cooler. She also planned to request all the shelter's maintenance records for their refrigeration equipment to see if there was a pattern of neglect. 2 days later, I was sitting at my kitchen table going through emails when a message arrived from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line just said important information, and when I opened it, I found forwarded messages from Mika to shelter staff. The first one said they could not delay the meal service regardless of concerns. The second one told staff to use their judgment on food preparation. Both messages were dated the morning of the incident. I immediately forwarded the entire email to both the public defender and the health inspector with a note explaining where it came from. I had no idea who sent it, but someone inside the shelter was clearly trying to help Jordan. That same afternoon, I was scrolling through social media when I found a short video someone had posted from the morning of the incident. The footage showed Jordan in the parking lot waving his arms and trying to get people to move away from the food truck area. He was clearly trying to warn people, not attack anyone. His body language showed urgency and concern, not violence or aggression. I downloaded the video immediately and sent it to the public defender with shaking hands. This was visual proof that contradicted Mika's entire narrative about Jordan being aggressive and disturbed. The accident expert called me 3 days after I'd hired him and said his full report was ready. He'd examined both vehicles thoroughly and taken detailed measurements of all the impact damage. His conclusion was that the crash was consistent with someone trying to block the truck's service window rather than destroy the entire vehicle. The impact speed was only about 15 miles per hour based on the damage patterns and the way the metal had crumpled. This matched exactly what Jordan had told me about panicking and just wanting to stop them from serving the food. I paid the expert his remaining fee and asked him to send copies of the report to both the public defender and the prosecutor's office. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing with news alerts. Mika was holding a press conference at the shelter, and the local news was covering it live. I turned on my laptop and watched as she stood in front of cameras claiming she was the victim of a smear campaign. She said Jordan's family was trying to destroy her reputation and the shelter's good work in the community. She talked about all the people they'd helped over the years and how dedicated the staff was to serving those in need. She made no mention whatsoever of the food safety concerns or the voice recording that proved Jordan had been trying to warn people. I felt my blood pressure rising as I watched her twist the entire situation to make herself look like the victim. 2 hours later, the health inspector called to tell me she was issuing a formal notice of investigation to the shelter. Their food service permit would be temporarily suspended until a full safety audit could be completed. She said the evidence we'd provided, along with the statements from the veterans who got sick, was enough to warrant immediate action. I thanked her and hung up just as another news alert came through on my phone. Mika was already blaming me publicly for taking food away from hungry people. She'd posted on social media that my vendetta against her was hurting the most vulnerable members of our community. I sat there staring at my phone and realized I needed to do something to help the veterans who actually would go hungry while the shelter was under investigation. I spent the rest of that day setting up a crowdfunding campaign to provide alternative meals for the veterans during the investigation period. I wrote a detailed explanation of why the shelter's permit had been suspended and what we were trying to accomplish. I shared the campaign on every social media platform I could think of and sent it to everyone I knew. The community response was overwhelming and immediate. Within 6 hours, we'd raised enough money to cover meals for 2 weeks. People kept donating and sharing the campaign with messages of support for Jordan and concern about the shelter's food safety practices. By the end of the first day, we had enough funding to cover a full month of alternative meal service. The next morning, the public defender called and asked me to come to her office to review some documents she'd found. I drove over immediately, and she spread out papers across her desk, showing timestamps from Jordan's intake at the police station. She pointed to the confession signature time and then showed me the medical evaluation schedule that was supposed to happen at the exact same moment. I stared at the papers, trying to make sense of how Jordan could sign a confession while getting a medical checkup in a different part of the building. The public defender explained this proved the intake process was rushed and done wrong, which meant we could argue the confession shouldn't be allowed as evidence. I felt a small bit of hope for the first time since this whole thing started. She made copies of everything and said she'd file a motion right away to get the confession thrown out. I left her office and drove to find the 3 veterans Robert had told me about who got sick after eating at the shelter. The first guy was staying at a different shelter across town, and he remembered me from when Jordan used to volunteer. He told me his stomach started hurting bad about 6 hours after the Christmas meal, and he spent most of the night throwing up. I asked him to write down everything he remembered about his symptoms, and he filled out 2 pages describing the pain and sickness. The second veteran was harder to find, but I eventually located him at the library where he went during the day to stay warm. He described the same timeline, saying the stomach cramps started that evening and lasted through the next day. The third person was a woman who usually stayed near the shelter, and she got really upset talking about how sick she'd been. She said at least 5 other people she knew had the same symptoms, but most folks didn't want to make a big deal about it because they were worried the shelter would close and they'd have nowhere to go for meals. When I got home that afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. A woman introduced herself as a reporter from the local newspaper and said she'd heard about Jordan's case and wanted to do an interview. My first reaction was to say no because I didn't want more attention on our family, but she explained she was interested in the food safety angle and Mika's response to the concerns Jordan had raised. I told her I needed to think about it and call her back. I immediately phoned the public defender and explained about the interview request. She thought for a minute and then said controlled media coverage might actually help us by countering Mika's version of events that was already out there. She warned me to stick to facts and not get emotional or make accusations I couldn't prove. I called the reporter back and agreed to meet her the next day at a coffee shop downtown. The reporter showed up with a notebook and recording device and asked me to walk through everything that happened Christmas Eve. I told her about Jordan's volunteer work, the voice recording on his phone, and the evidence we'd been gathering about the spoiled meat. She took notes on everything and said she wanted to do some checking on her own before publishing anything. 2 days later, she called me back sounding excited and said she'd discovered the discount meat vendor Mika used had been cited multiple times by health inspectors over the past year for selling products past their safe dates. The reporter had copies of the inspection reports and was planning a story about how the shelter's budget problems were leading to dangerous food choices that put vulnerable people at risk. She said the article would run in the Sunday paper and asked if I wanted to make any additional comments. I told her I just wanted people to understand Jordan was trying to help, not hurt anyone. My phone rang again that evening and it was Frank calling in a panic. His voice was shaking as he explained that Mika had confronted him in the shelter office about talking to me and threatened to fire him immediately. He was terrified about losing his job and didn't know what to do. I told him to hold on and called the public defender on 3-way so we could all talk together. The public defender listened to Frank describe the confrontation and then explained that firing him right now would look like retaliation for telling the truth, which would actually help our case even more. She told Frank to document everything Mika said and keep copies of any emails or messages. Frank sounded a bit calmer after that, but said he was still scared about what might happen next. The following morning, the public defender called with news that the prosecutor's office had reached out about a possible plea deal. They were offering to reduce the charges to misdemeanor property damage if Jordan would plead guilty and pay money to fix the truck. I felt my blood pressure spike immediately because they were still treating my son like a criminal when all he did was try to stop people from getting poisoned. The public defender must have heard the anger in my voice because she jumped in quickly and told me to calm down. She explained we should at least hear them out and understand what they're offering, but that didn't mean we had to accept anything that would give Jordan a criminal record. She said having the option of a deal gave us more power in negotiations, and we could use it as leverage. I spent the rest of that day trying to process everything. The idea that Jordan might have to plead guilty to anything made me sick, but I also understood the risk of going to trial and potentially losing. The public defender called again that evening and said the suppression hearing for Jordan's confession was now scheduled for the following week. She needed both me and Jordan to come to her office so she could prepare us to testify about what happened during his arrest and the rushed intake process. We spent 3 hours going over every detail of that day, with her asking us questions over and over until we could answer clearly and consistently. Jordan was nervous about having to talk in court, but the public defender assured him the judge just wanted to hear the truth about what happened. That weekend, I cleared my schedule completely so the public defender and I could review all the evidence we'd gathered. We spread everything out on my dining room table and went through it piece by piece. The voice recording of Jordan warning about the meat was the strongest proof we had. Frank's testimony about Mika ignoring his concerns about the spoiled delivery backed that up. The written statements from the 3 sick veterans showed people actually did get food poisoning from eating at the shelter. The accident expert's report proved the crash was low speed and looked more like Jordan was trying to block the truck than destroy it. The vendor invoices showed the shelter was buying cheap meat from a supplier with a bad safety record. The anonymous emails we'd received showed Mika had ordered staff to serve the food regardless of concerns. Looking at everything together, it seemed impossible that anyone could still think Jordan was just some disturbed kid who randomly attacked a food truck. On Monday morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Frank asking if he could stop by my house before work. I texted back yes, and 20 minutes later he was at my door looking terrified and exhausted. He pulled a small USB drive from his pocket and handed it to me with shaking hands. He explained it had copies of the shelter's temperature logs showing the cooler had been broken and running warm for an entire week before Christmas. Frank said his conscience wouldn't let him stay quiet anymore, even though he was scared about losing his job and maybe never finding another one. I thanked him and promised we'd do everything possible to protect him. After he left, I plugged the USB drive into my laptop and opened the files. The temperature readings were right there in black and white, showing the cooler had been running 10 degrees too warm for days, while meat and other food sat inside getting dangerous to eat. The courtroom was smaller than I expected when we arrived for the suppression hearing 3 days later. Jordan sat next to the public defender at a wooden table, while I took a seat in the gallery behind them. The prosecutor shuffled papers at her table across the aisle. Mika sat in the back row wearing another business suit and staring straight ahead. The judge entered and everyone stood, then sat back down when he gestured for us to do so. The public defender called the officer who had processed Jordan's confession on Christmas Eve. He walked to the witness stand looking uncomfortable in his dress uniform. Under questioning, he admitted the station had been running on minimal holiday staffing that day. He explained they were trying to process multiple arrests quickly so officers could get home to their families. When the public defender asked him to check the timestamp on Jordan's signed confession, he pulled out a file and his face went pale. The confession was signed at 2:15 in the afternoon, which was the exact same time Jordan was supposed to be getting his mandatory medical evaluation. The officer couldn't explain how Jordan signed a document while being examined by the nurse in a completely different part of the building. The judge leaned forward and asked the officer to repeat that timeline. The officer stammered through it again, his voice getting quieter. The prosecutor objected and tried to argue the timestamps might be wrong, but the judge told her to sit down. Next, the public defender asked to play the voice recording from Jordan's phone as evidence. The prosecutor objected again, claiming it was hearsay, but the judge overruled her and told the bailiff to set up the audio equipment. The courtroom went silent as the recording started. Jordan's voice came through the speakers saying he couldn't let them serve that meat because it smelled wrong and people would get sick. Then a male voice, angry and dismissive, told him to mind his own business because they were behind schedule. You could hear Jordan pleading, explaining about the greenish color and the ammonia smell. The male voice got louder, telling Jordan to leave before they called the police on him for interfering. Several people in the courtroom shifted in their seats. One woman in the gallery put her hand over her mouth. Mika stared at the floor. The judge asked to hear it again, so the bailiff played it a second time. When it finished, the courtroom stayed quiet for a long moment. The public defender called the accident expert next. He was a middle-aged guy who ran an independent collision analysis business. He brought printed photos and diagrams showing the damage to both Frank's car and the food truck. He explained the impact speed was only about 15 miles per hour based on the crush patterns and the position of the debris. He pointed to measurements showing the angle of impact suggested Jordan was trying to position the car to block the serving window, not ram the truck for maximum destruction. This contradicted Mika's earlier testimony about a violent, high-speed attack meant to cause as much damage as possible. The prosecutor tried to argue during cross-examination that 15 miles per hour could still be dangerous, but the expert calmly explained that parking lot fender benders typically happened at similar speeds. The judge thanked him and dismissed him from the stand. Then the judge announced he was suppressing Jordan's confession as improperly obtained due to the timeline inconsistencies and the chaotic intake process. He ruled that the voice recording and the accident expert's report could be admitted as evidence if the case went to trial. The prosecutor looked frustrated, but not particularly surprised by the decision. She asked for a 15-minute recess to consult with her office. The judge agreed, and everyone stood as he left the courtroom. Jordan turned around and looked at me with cautious hope in his eyes. I gave him a small nod but didn't want to celebrate yet. During the recess, the public defender told us this was a good sign, and the prosecution's case was falling apart without the confession. After 15 minutes, everyone returned to their seats and the judge came back in. The prosecutor stood and addressed the court, saying her office was willing to offer a revised plea agreement. She explained Jordan could plead guilty to misdemeanor reckless driving with no jail time, just probation and community service. The property damage charge would be dropped completely. The judge asked if we needed time to consider the offer. The public defender requested a 30-minute break to discuss it with us. We went to a small conference room down the hall where the public defender explained what the deal meant. Jordan would avoid any felony conviction and wouldn't have to serve time in jail. He would be on probation for a year and need to complete community service hours, but his record would stay relatively clean. If we rejected the deal and went to trial, there was still a risk the jury might convict him of the felony property damage charge despite all our evidence. I asked Jordan what he wanted to do. He took a deep breath and admitted he did panic that morning when no one would listen to him. He explained that when he took Frank's keys without permission and drove the car toward the truck, the floor mat somehow slid forward and jammed under the brake pedal. He couldn't stop the car as quickly as he wanted and hit the truck harder than he meant to. Jordan said he was willing to accept responsibility for his poor judgment and how he handled the situation, even though his intentions were good and he was trying to prevent people from getting poisoned. The public defender explained that going to trial was expensive and risky. Even with strong evidence about the food safety concerns, a jury might still find him guilty of felony property damage. With the plea deal, Jordan would avoid jail completely and keep his record relatively clean. We talked through all the options for 20 minutes. Finally, I told Jordan the decision was his to make since it was his future at stake. He looked at me and said he wanted to take the deal because he didn't want to risk going to jail, and he knew taking Frank's car without asking was wrong. We went back to the courtroom and told the judge we accepted the plea agreement. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks out and reminded Jordan he needed to stay out of trouble until then. We left the courthouse that afternoon feeling exhausted but relieved. 2 days later, the health inspector released her official findings about the shelter. Her report documented multiple food safety violations, including the broken cooler that had been running warm for over a week, inadequate temperature monitoring procedures, and the acceptance of meat products that were too close to their expiration dates. She mandated immediate corrections and required all shelter staff to complete food safety retraining before the facility's food service permit could be reinstated. The shelter had to stop serving meals until everything was fixed. That same week, the shelter's board of directors held an emergency meeting and voted to place Mika on administrative leave while they conducted their own internal investigation. Frank was promoted to interim director and immediately started implementing better food safety protocols. He ordered new refrigeration equipment and set up a system where staff had to check and log food temperatures twice daily. The reporter who had been investigating the story published her article in the local paper. It was long and detailed, covering the shelter's budget pressures over the past year, the food safety violations the health inspector found, Jordan's volunteer history, and his concerns about the spoiled meat and the questionable way his arrest and confession had been handled. The article presented both sides fairly, including quotes from Mika defending her decisions and quotes from Frank explaining the pressure they were under to stretch limited resources. The article included statements from the 3 veterans who got food poisoning on Christmas Eve. It also mentioned the crowdfunding campaign that had raised money to provide alternative meals while the shelter was closed. Some people in the comment section praised Jordan for preventing a larger outbreak. Others criticized him for damaging property instead of following proper reporting procedures. The article didn't take sides, but laid out all the facts and let readers form their own opinions. The next few days brought mixed reactions from people in town. Some folks left angry comments on the article saying Jordan should have followed proper channels instead of destroying property. They posted photos of the damaged truck and called him reckless. Others defended him in the comments section, pointing out that he tried to report the problem first and only acted when no one would listen. The The crowdfunding campaign kept bringing in donations throughout the week. People sent money for meals and also started contributing specifically for truck repairs. Frank posted updates showing the new food safety procedures he was putting in place at the shelter. He thanked everyone for their support and promised things would be different going forward. 2 weeks later, we arrived at the courthouse for Jordan's sentencing hearing. The courtroom felt huge and intimidating with its tall ceilings and dark wood everywhere. Jordan sat next to the public defender at a table facing the judge's bench. I sat right behind them in the first row. The judge called the hearing to order and asked if anyone wanted to speak on Jordan's behalf before sentencing. Jordan's math teacher stood up first and talked about how he always helped other students who were struggling. She said he spent his lunch periods tutoring kids who couldn't afford private help. His basketball coach went next and described Jordan as a team player who never caused problems and always showed up early to practice. He mentioned that Jordan organized a fundraiser last year to buy new equipment for the team. Then Robert walked to the front of the courtroom. His voice shook as he talked about his daughter. He explained that Jordan had been tutoring her in reading for 6 months without asking for anything in return. He said Jordan treated homeless people with respect and dignity, never looking down on anyone or acting like he was better than them. Robert wiped his eyes and told the judge that Jordan saved lives by stopping that spoiled meat from being served. Several other people in the courtroom nodded in agreement. The judge listened to everything and then looked at Jordan directly. She said she understood he was trying to help people, but his methods were dangerous and illegal. She explained that stealing a car and destroying property couldn't be excused even with good intentions. Jordan nodded and said he understood. The judge sentenced him to 1 year of probation with regular check-ins with a probation officer. She also required 100 hours of community service at a different nonprofit organization, not the shelter. Jordan had to complete a class on conflict resolution and proper reporting procedures, so he would know better ways to handle similar situations in the future. The judge made it clear there would be no jail time and no requirement to pay money for the truck repairs. She said Jordan's clean record and character references convinced her he deserved a second chance. Jordan thanked the judge quietly. We left the courthouse that afternoon feeling exhausted but grateful it wasn't worse. That same week, Jordan started seeing a therapist to work through what happened. The first few sessions were hard because he didn't want to talk about being arrested and locked up. He told me the holding cell was cold and smelled like cleaning chemicals. The other kids in there were scary and he couldn't sleep at all. His therapist explained that what he experienced was real trauma and it would take time to process. Jordan started having nightmares about being trapped in small spaces. He would wake up sweating and breathing hard. At the school, he got nervous whenever he saw police officers or security guards. His hands would shake and his heart would race. The therapist taught him breathing exercises to calm down when the anxiety hit. She helped him understand that his fear response was normal after what he went through. Slowly, over the next several weeks, the nightmares became less frequent. Jordan learned coping strategies for when he felt panic rising. The therapy sessions gave him a safe place to talk about his feelings without judgment. One evening, about a week after sentencing, I asked Jordan to sit down with me at the kitchen table. I needed to apologize for something that had been bothering me since Christmas Eve. I told him I was sorry for doubting him at the police station when I saw that video footage. I explained that seeing what looked like evidence of him doing something violent made me question what I knew about him. I should have trusted him completely from the start, instead of letting Mika's narrative get into my head. Jordan looked down at the table and said he understood why I had doubts. The video looked bad, and he had actually stolen Frank's car and crashed it. But I shook my head and told him that wasn't the point. The point was that I knew who he was as a person, and I should have held on to that knowledge no matter what anyone else said or showed me. We talked for over an hour about trust and communication. I promised him that from now on, I would always listen to his concerns first before jumping to any conclusions. Jordan said he should have come to me before taking matters into his own hands. We both agreed we needed to be better about talking to each other when problems came up. That conversation felt like a turning point for us. 3 weeks after the sentencing, the health inspector released her final official report about the shelter. The document was 12 pages long and listed every problem she found during her investigation. She required the shelter to replace all their old refrigeration equipment with new commercial-grade coolers and freezers. The shelter had to set up a system for checking and recording food temperatures twice every day. Staff members needed to log the temperatures in a book that would be reviewed during inspections. The report also said the shelter couldn't accept any food donations that were within 5 days of their expiration date. This rule would prevent them from taking the kind of questionable meat that caused the whole problem. The health inspector gave the shelter 60 days to make all the changes and complete the required staff training. The shelter's board held a meeting that same week and voted to approve funding for all the improvements. They took money from their reserve fund to pay for the new equipment. Frank told me later that the board members were scared of being sued if anyone got sick from their food. The same day the health inspector's report came out, Mika released a public statement through the shelter's website. I read it 3 times trying to find an actual apology, but never saw one. She wrote about taking responsibility for process gaps that allowed food safety issues to develop. She said budget pressures over the past year had led to difficult choices about food sourcing. Mika acknowledged that some decisions made under financial stress weren't ideal. but she never actually admitted to knowingly serving spoiled meat to hungry people. She never said she was wrong to ignore Jordan's warnings or to rush that Christmas meal service. The statement felt carefully written by a lawyer to avoid admitting real fault. I called the public defender and complained about how vague and non-apologetic it was. She sighed and said that was probably the best we would get from Mika. She explained that people in positions like that rarely admit full responsibility because it opens them up to lawsuits. I understood the legal reasoning, but it still made me angry. Jordan deserved a real apology for being right about the food and for trying to protect people. 4 weeks after Christmas, Jordan and I volunteered together at a different homeless services organization across town. This group focused on delivering hot meals directly to people living on the streets instead of running a shelter. We showed up Saturday morning and helped load insulated containers full of soup and sandwiches into a van. Then we drove around to different locations where homeless people gathered. At each stop, we handed out meals and talked to people. Jordan recognized a few faces from Mika's shelter. They asked him what happened with the food truck, and he explained the whole story. Most of them thanked him for looking out for their safety. One older woman hugged him and said he was a good kid. Working side by side with Jordan that morning felt peaceful. We didn't talk much, just focused on serving food and treating people with respect. It felt like a quiet moment of healing between us. The volunteer coordinator asked if we wanted to come back next week, and we both said yes. Helping people together gave us a way to move forward from everything that happened. By early February, we finalized a payment plan for the remaining costs from the public defender and the accident expert. The legal fees and expert analysis had cost almost $8,000 total. We couldn't pay it all at once without emptying our savings completely. The public defender's office agreed to let us spread the payments over 6 months. I would pay about $1,300 per month until everything was covered. It meant cutting back on other expenses and skipping some things we normally did, but it was manageable. Some people in town still gave us dirty looks when they saw us at the grocery store or gas station. I heard whispers about the damaged truck and how much it cost to repair. A few parents at Jordan's school stopped letting their kids hang out with him. But most people moved on to other news and stopped paying attention to our situation. Jordan completed what he set out to do by preventing a serious food poisoning outbreak. 300 people could have gotten really sick if that spoiled meat had been served. We both found peace in knowing he did the right thing, even though the path was messy and complicated. Life slowly returned to normal as winter turned into spring. And that's the story wrapped up. I always try to share something you can use or think about long after the video ends. If this one helped even a little, I am glad. Subscribe so you will not miss what comes next.